The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. John had always enjoyed Sundays. The peace, the warmth of the afternoon sun, and the stillness of his front yard. Everything about it felt perfect. Today, he had set up his 2 lawn chairs on the patch of grass near his porch, just outside the small picket fence that separated his world from the rest of the neighborhood. He had no plans, no agenda, just the simple act of unwinding with a cold glass of lemonade and the pages of his favorite book. The world outside his yard seemed to move in slow motion, and he liked it that way. John settled back, feeling the soft fabric of the chair mold to his body as the gentle breeze tousled his hair. A few birds chirped from the nearby trees, and the sound of kids playing in the distance added to the idyllic atmosphere. It was a scene straight out of a postcard. But what John didn't realize was that a storm was quietly brewing, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Across the street, through the windows of her pristinely kept house, Karen watched. John's lawn chairs were barely noticeable to anyone else, just a man enjoying his free time on a Sunday. But not to Karen. She had been eyeing John for weeks, always finding fault in the way he lived his life. She didn't like the way his lawn chairs were positioned, or how they seemingly took up too much of her view. Every day, she found something new to complain about, whether it was the way his lawn was trimmed, or the occasional loud conversation with a neighbor on his front porch. It wasn't just his chairs this time. No, it was everything about him. And she was done letting it slide. Her eyes narrowed as she dialed 911, a malicious sense of purpose settling over her. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "There's a man across the street causing a ruckus. He's just sitting there with his lawn chairs, blocking the view. I think it's a violation of the neighborhood rules." John had no idea. He sat in his chair, legs stretched out, flipping through the pages of his book, unaware of the call that had just been made. The world around him was still, quiet, serene. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The distant sound of a siren sliced through the air, a jarring interruption to the peaceful day. John's head snapped up, confusion quickly flooding his mind. He saw the red and blue lights flashing through the trees at the end of his street. A squad car came into view, its sirens blaring louder as it sped toward his house. His heart rate picked up. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant a visit from the police. The car pulled up to the curb in front of his house, the officers inside taking a moment to survey the situation. John's confusion deepened. He stood slowly, watching as the officers stepped out of their car, their faces unreadable, as if they were just as puzzled by the call as he was. "What's going on?" he muttered under his breath. But before he could even approach them, one of the officers turned to him, their expression strained but professional. "Sir, we've received a complaint about a disturbance," the officer said, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. "Do you mind telling us what's going on here?" John's gaze shifted between the officer and his lawn chairs. A disturbance. Over lawn chairs. And then, from across the street, there she was, Karen, marching over like a storm cloud ready to burst. The slight breeze seemed to stutter as her presence sucked all the calm out of the air. John's mind raced. Was this really happening? Why would anyone call the police over something so trivial? His pulse quickened as Karen's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. "These chairs. He's been sitting there for hours, disturbing the peace. He's blocking the view for everyone on this block. I demand something be done." John stood frozen, the officers caught in the middle of the storm. This wasn't just a complaint, it was a personal attack. His heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension building, thickening in the air like the pressure before a lightning strike. What was Karen really trying to do? Was she trying to control him, intimidate him, or was something darker at play here? The officers exchanged glances. The air was charged with something else now, something far more dangerous than a simple complaint. And John could feel it. It was only a matter of time before everything blew up. John's gaze lingered on Karen, the woman standing across the street, her arms folded tightly as if she had already won some unseen battle. The way she glared at him, standing there like a judge in her own little courtroom, sent an uneasy chill through his spine. For a split second, he wondered if he had entered some twisted version of reality, where lawn chairs could provoke full-blown police intervention. He glanced back at the two officers, who exchanged uncertain looks. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. The one officer, a tall man with a furrowed brow, cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his tone stiff but calm, "can you explain what's going on here?" John could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm just sitting here, enjoying the day," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the chairs, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong." The second officer, a woman with short-cropped hair, frowned slightly, looking from John to Karen. "And she's claiming you're disturbing the peace?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. John opened his mouth to protest, but Karen's voice cut him off, sharp as a knife. "He's been out here all day," she snapped. "Who knows what he's doing in those chairs? People are trying to relax, but instead we have to watch him sit there, taking up space. I've had enough." John's chest tightened. He could feel the frustration rising in his throat, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't just about lawn chairs. It wasn't just a complaint. This was her trying to assert control over his life. This was her trying to rewrite the rules of peaceful living. But why? What was her real agenda? The officers glanced at each other again, clearly uncomfortable with how absurd this was. One officer shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his radio as if he was ready to call for backup, or perhaps just to make sense of the situation. John could almost hear the wheels turning in their heads. Could this be some sort of personal vendetta? Or was Karen just someone who enjoyed causing trouble? Before he could gather his thoughts, Karen continued. "You're letting him get away with this?" she demanded, her voice escalating, as though trying to provoke a reaction. "How many more complaints will it take before you do something about this disruption?" A tense silence fell over them all. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The officers were clearly torn. They didn't want to escalate things, but they had no real evidence of a crime, no actual cause for concern. John had done nothing wrong. Yet, as they stood there, the strange quiet seemed to intensify. John glanced at the officers. They looked like they were about to give in, like they might actually consider Karen's accusations, but that would mean giving in to the madness. His blood began to boil. Something had to be done. Something had to tip the scales in his favor. He noticed the officer with the furrowed brow glancing back at Karen, perhaps looking for the right words to diffuse the situation. But she was relentless, unyielding. It was clear she wasn't going to back down. John's mind raced. This wasn't just a nuisance. It felt like an outright attack on his sense of peace. It was more than just a neighbor who didn't like him. Karen's presence was suffocating, like she was hunting for an excuse to disrupt his life. In that moment, John realized he had one option left, one thing that could shift the balance of power in his favor. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would make the difference between letting this woman control his day and reclaiming his right to a peaceful life. With slow deliberation, John reached into his pocket. The leather of his wallet felt cold against his fingers, the anticipation growing as he pulled out the one card that could silence the storm, his government ID. It wasn't just any ID. It was an official badge, one that held weight, authority, and respect. It wasn't something he pulled out often, but when he did, it carried a message that said, "I am not someone you can intimidate." John held the card at his side, waiting for the right moment, knowing that when he flashed it, everything would change. It would shift the dynamic. It would end this ridiculous charade. The tension in the air thickened as he locked eyes with the officers, their hesitation palpable. Karen stood just a few feet away, her arms still crossed, her lips pressed together in a tight line of defiance. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did the officers. But John did. The siren's wail slowly died down, leaving behind a thick silence that enveloped the scene. The tension in the air was suffocating, like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He stood still, heart pounding, as the two officers surveyed the scene, the sunlight casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Karen's stare was unwavering. She stood there with her arms crossed, an air of superiority radiating off her. She was determined, unwavering, as if her complaint was the only truth in the world. And yet John could feel the absurdity of it all gnawing at him. How had a simple afternoon spent in lawn chairs become a matter for the police? The officer with the furrowed brow stepped forward, his gaze darting between John and Karen. "So, sir," he began slowly, his voice guarded, "you're telling us that you're just sitting here?" His question was more of a statement than a query, his tone a little incredulous. John nodded, his voice even but laced with a hint of frustration. "Yes, officer, just sitting here, enjoying a peaceful afternoon." But before the officer could respond, Karen interjected with a snap. "He's been sitting there for hours," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "And it's not just the chairs. He's disturbing everyone around here. What if children were trying to play, or someone wanted to sit in their front yard? He's blocking the view. And the noise. What's that rustling sound coming from those chairs?" Her words felt absurd, but her confidence made it clear she was trying to make this into something bigger, something more sinister than it was. John's patience was wearing thin, but he forced himself to stay calm. The more she spoke, the more she sounded like someone searching for a fight, desperate to impose her will on the world around her. The officers exchanged a brief glance. The woman officer, her face still set in a neutral expression, seemed just as bewildered as John was. "Is that really a complaint?" she asked, clearly struggling to understand the depth of Karen's accusations. Karen's mouth tightened. "Yes, it is." She pointed to the chairs again, as though they were the root of all evil in the neighborhood. "He's a nuisance, and this whole peaceful afternoon routine is just an excuse to break the rules." John's mind raced as he tried to hold his ground. He knew there was no logical reason to escalate this further. He hadn't done anything wrong, but something felt off. The officers seemed to be losing their grip on the situation. Their uncertainty was palpable, and that's when John realized something. They weren't just here because of Karen. They were here because of her persistent, suffocating pressure. She had called the cops before. John could see it in the way the officers were reacting to her, a mix of familiarity and forced politeness. Karen wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was his serial complainer, someone who reveled in creating chaos under the guise of order. And now she was using the law to play her games. John's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about lawn chairs anymore. It was about control. It was about Karen using her power to make people bend to her will. He had to do something before this spiraled out of control, before Karen's petty grievances became the law of the land. His fingers tightened around the ID in his pocket. The power it held wasn't just in the symbol, it was in the shift it represented. The shift from submission to defiance, from victim to victor. He wasn't going to let this woman destroy his peace, just as Karen was about to unleash another tirade. John's voice cut through the thick tension. "I'm done explaining myself," he said, his tone calm but firm. He pulled out the ID and flashed it in the officer's direction, his eyes never leaving Karen's face. The change was instant. The officers stopped mid-motion, their eyes darting down to the ID in John's hand. The world seemed to hold its breath. Karen's smug smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as the officer's expressions shifted. Something had just changed in the balance of power. John could feel it. The shift was palpable, like a door creaking open, revealing a truth Karen hadn't anticipated. The officers froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The air crackled with the sudden tension, and Karen, for the first time, looked vulnerable. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her lips. The game had shifted, and she hadn't seen it coming. The instant the ID gleamed in the sunlight, the atmosphere shifted. The officers stood rigid, eyes glued to the badge in John's hand. A charged silence settled over the scene, and for a split second, it felt like time itself had frozen. The power balance had irrevocably shifted. The air seemed to crackle with tension, thick and heavy. John's heartbeat raced, but his outward calm was unshakable. Karen, on the other hand, was no longer the assertive woman she had been moments ago. Her eyes widened as she looked from the badge to John's face, her lips twitching as if trying to process what had just happened. Her entire posture seemed to deflate, the swagger of someone used to being in control draining from her. She opened her mouth, ready to retort, but the words stalled, a strange, unnerving uncertainty overtaking her. The male officer, whose brow had been furrowed in confusion earlier, took a small step forward, his posture straightening, now exuding a quiet professionalism. "Sir," he began, his voice neutral but respectful, "may I ask where this ID comes from?" John stood tall, the quiet power of the moment radiating from him. "It's a government-issued identification," he replied calmly, "and it's the last thing I ever wanted to show you. But I believe we've crossed a line here. A very unnecessary line." His voice was steady, but every word carried weight. The second officer, the woman with short hair, exchanged a glance with her partner, the tension between them palpable. John could feel the shift in the officer's demeanor. The uncertainty had faded, replaced with an unspoken understanding. They were no longer questioning him. Instead, they seemed to be reevaluating the situation entirely. Karen's chest heaved in anger, but she was no longer the woman on the offensive. She was the one who was cornered, trapped by her own accusations. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice rising. "You can't just ignore my complaint. I was doing the right thing, reporting a disturbance. This man is causing trouble, and now you're siding with him." Her outburst only made the officers' discomfort more obvious. They stood there, silent for a moment, watching her as though waiting for her to realize that she had just walked herself into a corner. The power was no longer hers to command, and she was losing control in front of the one person who refused to back down. The officer who had been silent until now, a younger man with sharp eyes, finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his gaze fixed on her, "we've had multiple reports of you making unfounded complaints in the neighborhood. About noise, about neighbors just living their lives." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "We don't take complaints lightly, but we also don't allow personal grievances to turn into something that could escalate unnecessarily." Karen's mouth fell open in shock, her face blanching. The officers weren't just on John's side now. They were distancing themselves from her, and her reputation was being quietly revealed. Her shoulders slumped as the realization hit. This wasn't just about the lawn chairs. This was a pattern of harassment, and now it was unraveling in front of everyone. John could feel the victory rising within him, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he turned back to the officers, offering a simple nod of acknowledgement, his hand still loosely holding the ID. He had taken his stand, and it had worked. The storm was dying down, the dark clouds slowly dispersing. Karen took an unsteady step backward, her hands trembling as she struggled to regain control of the situation. But her eyes, those cold, sharp eyes, betrayed her. There was no escape now. The mask had fallen, and everyone could see who she truly was. A woman who had used fear and manipulation as weapons, hoping to silence those she couldn't control. But John wasn't one of her victims. "I'm done here," Karen hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, as she turned on her heel, retreating to her house in defeat. But the damage was done. Her power over the neighborhood had been exposed for all to see. John watched her go, his heart still hammering in his chest. The officers stood silently, still processing the chain of events that had unfolded. The air had cleared, but the tension still lingered, a faint reminder of just how close it had all come to spiraling out of control. And then, just as he thought it was over, the younger officer spoke again, his voice low but filled with something else, something John hadn't expected. "Sir," the officer said, "we appreciate your patience today. You handled this better than most would have." There was a pause, a moment of quiet acknowledgement. "By the way, you might want to check your porch. Someone's been tampering with your door." The words hung in the air like a cold breeze. John froze. The peaceful afternoon had just taken a sharp turn. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. John's pulse quickened as the officer's words lingered in the air, the meaning of them sinking into him like cold steel. "Someone's been tampering with your door." The officers exchanged glances, their faces momentarily clouded with concern. The peaceful afternoon, once so idyllic, now felt like a fragile illusion. Something had shifted, again. And this time, the tension was far more personal. His thoughts raced as he processed the officer's words. Tampering with his door. That wasn't a random statement. He hadn't noticed anything odd when he'd left the house earlier, but then again, he hadn't been paying close attention to the finer details of his surroundings. He'd been too preoccupied with the absurdity of Karen's complaint. "What do you mean by tampering?" John asked, his voice steady, but his mind was in overdrive, searching for any clue that could make sense of this new development. The younger officer glanced at his partner, who nodded slightly, then turned to John. "There's evidence of someone trying to force entry. The door's been scratched up, and the lock was slightly disturbed. Not completely broken, but it looks like someone was trying to get in." His voice lowered, his gaze flickering to the street, as if ensuring no one else was eavesdropping. "We didn't want to alarm you, but we thought you should know." John felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just some random act of mischief. Someone had been trying to break into his house, his home, the place where he should feel safest. His first instinct was to head inside and check, but he forced himself to stay calm. The officers were here. If it was serious, they'd handle it. But then, as he glanced across the street, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was brief. Just a flash of something, perhaps a shadow, a figure moving quickly behind the curtains of Karen's window. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Was it her? Was she involved in this? Had she escalated things further? Or was there something, or someone, else at play? John swallowed hard, keeping his face neutral. "I appreciate the heads up," he said, trying to mask the knot of unease forming in his stomach. "But can you give me any more details? Was it recent?" The female officer, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "We're not sure. It could have been last night or earlier today. The door wasn't damaged enough to warrant a break-in call, but it's still concerning. We'll send someone over to do a full investigation later, but you should be aware. Keep your doors locked. And maybe check your security system." John nodded, though his mind was already racing. If Karen was involved, he had to understand why. Had she gone so far as to try to make his life unbearable? Or was this something more insidious, something deeper than petty neighborhood grievances? As the officers began to discuss the next steps, John's thoughts spiraled. The world felt smaller now, more dangerous. His front yard, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground. The cops, who had been called to calm a trivial complaint, now stood as witnesses to something much darker. But even they couldn't help him now. The situation was too tangled, too precarious. "I'll keep an eye on it," John said, still unsure of what exactly it meant. "Thanks for the information." The officers nodded, though their faces showed no signs of reassurance. They could only do so much. As the squad car pulled away, John stood alone in his front yard, the sense of unease thickening around him like fog. He turned to head inside but paused for a moment, glancing at Karen's house. She was still behind the curtains, and the flicker he had seen earlier made him wonder if she had been watching, waiting for something. The thought gnawed at him, a suspicion he couldn't shake. But before he could act on it, something caught his attention: his front door. There it was, just as the officer had described. The lock was slightly askew. The scratches on the wood were faint but unmistakable. Someone had tried to force it open. The weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor anymore. This had turned into something more sinister. Something was targeting him. John's eyes flicked back to Karen's house, her figure still hidden in the shadows behind her curtains. It was time to find out exactly what kind of trouble he was in, and whether Karen was the root of it. John's mind raced as he stood before his door, the faint scratches on the wood still fresh in his mind. Someone had tried to break in. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. But more than the damage to his property, it was the why that gnawed at him. Why now? Why him? And why didn't he notice it sooner? He turned back to Karen's house, her curtains still drawn tight, but now he could swear he saw a slight movement behind them, a shape, or just a trick of the light. He couldn't tell, but something in his gut told him that she had seen everything, that she knew far more than she was letting on. Was she watching him? Or was it someone else? John didn't trust his instincts in these moments. He had learned a long time ago that paranoia could cloud your judgment. But now, everything felt different. The feeling of being watched, the door tampered with, the bizarre encounter with the police, it all connected in a way that was impossible to ignore. He knew he needed answers, and he needed them fast. With a deep breath, John made his way to his backyard, where the sight of the lawn chairs still made him feel slightly ridiculous. But that brief moment of peacefulness had long passed, replaced by the unsettling weight of the unknown. As he walked across the yard, his eyes swept over the street. The neighborhood was eerily quiet now. The faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance was the only sound breaking the silence. No one else was outside. No one except Karen, who was still behind her curtains, still watching. John's fingers drummed nervously on the back gate as he considered his options. The situation had spiraled out of control so quickly that he didn't even know where to begin unraveling it. What could Karen be after? Had she escalated this situation to get him out of the neighborhood? Or was this something far more personal, something darker? His mind flickered back to the subtle way she had spoken during the exchange with the officers. Her words had been sharp, but there had been something else, something that had unsettled him. She wasn't just annoyed by his chairs. She was obsessed with controlling him, with making him bend to her will. It was as if she saw him as an obstacle to her perfect, ordered world. But why? John shook off the unsettling thought and reached into his pocket for his phone. He dialed his best friend, Even, and waited as the phone rang. He needed to talk to someone. He needed to make sense of all this. "Hey, man." Evan's voice crackled on the other end. "What's up?" "Something weird's going on," John muttered, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was around. "I think I'm being watched." Evan's voice shifted to concern. "What do you mean?" "Like, by Karen." "I don't know," John said, his frustration growing. "There's something off about her, man. The way she was acting today. She's been making all these bizarre complaints, and now." He paused. "Someone's been tampering with my door. Like they tried to break in. The officers didn't do much about it, but they told me to be careful. And I think she knows more than she's letting on." Even was silent for a moment. "That's messed up, dude. Have you thought about going to the police again? You can't just ignore this." "I can't just call them again for this. They'll think I'm overreacting," John replied, his voice tightening with anxiety. "But I've got to find out what she's really up to. I'm telling you, Even, there's something off about her." Even let out a sigh. "All right, man. Just be careful, okay? Watch your back." John hung up, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. The need for answers had never felt more urgent. He couldn't let Karen, or whoever was behind all this, push him around. He had to get to the truth. But how? A sudden, sharp noise made him freeze. It came from the direction of Karen's house, a faint scraping sound, like something, or someone, was moving along the fence line. John's breath caught in his throat. He stood completely still, every muscle tense, straining to hear. The sound continued, barely audible but persistent. Someone was definitely out there. Without thinking, he moved quickly, ducking down behind the fence to avoid being seen. He peered through the slats, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. His mind screamed at him to get back inside, to call the police again, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Then, through the crack between the boards, he saw it. A shadow. It was low, moving quickly across the yard. Too small to be an adult, too erratic to be an animal. It was a person. Someone was sneaking around in his backyard, close enough to be a real threat. His breath caught in his throat. Whoever it was, they were getting closer to his back door, the very door that had already been tampered with. The figure in his backyard moved with unnatural speed, slipping through the shadows as if it knew the landscape of his home better than he did. John's heart pounded against his ribs, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His thoughts raced, the familiar surroundings of his yard now a maze of danger, the air thick with an invisible tension. Whoever it was, they weren't here for a casual stroll. They were on a mission. John stayed crouched behind the fence, his breath shallow, his body frozen in place. The faint scraping sound continued, then stopped abruptly. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the figure moved again, this time slower and more deliberate. They were at his back door. John's pulse quickened. His mind screamed at him to do something. Anything. But he stayed motionless, afraid that the smallest movement would give him away. The figure seemed to be inspecting the door, running a gloved hand over the frame, checking for weaknesses in the lock. They were definitely looking for a way in, but why hadn't they just forced it open like the first time? It dawned on John then. Whoever this was, they were deliberate. They were being careful. And they weren't working alone. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Karen. She was behind this, wasn't she? She had orchestrated the tampering with his door earlier. Maybe this was her final push, her way of finishing what she had started. But this figure, this shadow, it was someone else, someone more dangerous. Without thinking, John stood up quickly, pressing his back to the fence, trying to make as little noise as possible. He had to act before this person slipped inside. Slowly, he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. He had to call the police again. This time, it wasn't a petty complaint. This time, it was real. His life was in danger. Just as he unlocked his phone, a sharp noise rang out, a creak from the back door. The figure had found something, a weakness in the door that he hadn't noticed. His stomach turned with the realization that his house was vulnerable. His sanctuary was no longer safe. The figure began to move again, this time heading towards the side of the house. John's instincts screamed at him to run, to get inside, but he fought the urge. If he moved now, he might lose the chance to get a closer look at this intruder, to figure out who they were. He needed information. He needed to know who was behind this. With a deep breath, John moved cautiously around the edge of the fence, keeping himself hidden from view. He made his way toward the corner of the house, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that every second he waited could be the moment this stranger discovered him. Then, just as he rounded the corner, he saw it, a dark figure crouched by the side of the house, staring at the back door, their silhouette outlined against the fading light. They were completely unaware of him. John's heart skipped a beat. He took another slow step forward, careful not to make a sound. The figure didn't notice him. Not yet. But as he moved closer, something strange happened. The figure turned suddenly, as if they had sensed him, their head snapping toward him with an eerie precision. For a split second, their eyes met, cold, calculating eyes that bore into him with the intensity of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. John froze, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The world felt like it had stopped, like everything around him had ceased to exist. In that instant, the figure stepped back, raising the hand to their face to shield their identity. A mask, thin black cloth covering most of their face, leaving only their eyes exposed. John's instincts kicked in. Run. But before he could react, the figure's hand moved with lightning speed. In one fluid motion, they pulled something from their waistband. Something small and metallic, gleaming in the dim light. John's heart lurched in panic. A weapon. He had to get out of there. He couldn't stay and confront this person. He needed to protect himself. His phone was still clutched in his hand, but now it felt useless. Without thinking, he darted back around the corner, heading for the safety of his front yard. The figure hadn't moved yet, but he could feel their presence like a shadow behind him, looming, waiting. His breaths came in short gasps as his mind scrambled for a plan. He made it to the front yard. But then something caught his eye. Karen's house. The curtains were open now, and in the window, her silhouette was unmistakable. She was watching, waiting. It clicked. She wasn't just an observer. She was a participant. She had been orchestrating this entire thing. The tampering with his door, the complaints, it had all been part of a plan, a strategy to drive him out, to push him into a corner. But why? Why go this far? John's mind swirled with questions as he bolted to his front door. Just as he reached for the handle, he heard a voice, one that cut through the silence like a blade. "You're not going anywhere, John." The voice was cold, familiar, yet foreign. It wasn't Karen's voice. This was someone else, someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment. John's stomach churned with dread. He spun around, adrenaline flooding his system, ready for whatever came next. John's heart pounded in his chest as the voice echoed through the night, sharp and chilling. The figure, still masked, stepped closer, their eyes never leaving him. The streetlights cast harsh shadows across their face, but their stance, confident, poised, left no doubt that they were no ordinary intruder. John's breath hitched. Whoever this was, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were waiting for him to make the wrong move. "You're not going anywhere, John," the voice repeated, this time with a darker edge. It was calm, almost too calm. John's mind spun, trying to make sense of it. Karen was behind all of this, but now there was a new player in the game. The question burned through him like fire. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond, just took another step forward, their movements deliberate and unnervingly controlled. They were trying to trap him, but John wasn't going to be the prey. He shifted his stance, positioning himself closer to his front door, ready to bolt if necessary. His hand clenched around the phone still in his pocket. But just as he took a half step back, the figure raised a hand, and the metallic object, a knife, flashed in the dim light. John's breath caught, his mind flashing to 1,000 escape plans in an instant. No time to call the cops. No time to run. He had to think fast, had to do something. But just as the knife glinted ominously in the stranger's hand, the sudden sound of a door opening behind him made him freeze. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Karen's voice. "You can't hide forever, John. You were never supposed to stay here." John whipped around, his pulse racing, only to see her standing in the doorway of her house, the smug look on her face chilling him more than the stranger in front of him. She stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, like a puppet master watching her show unfold. "Karen." John's voice broke through the haze of confusion. "What the hell is going on? What do you want from me?" She smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a ripple of dread through him. "You think this is about the lawn chairs? You're so naive, John. I've been watching you for months. You never realized, did you?" John's mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. Watching him. Months. What was she talking about? "You've been a problem from the moment you moved in," Karen continued, her voice low, almost soothing. "You didn't follow the rules. You didn't fit in. You were an eyesore, an embarrassment to the community. So I had to take care of it. But you just wouldn't leave. I had to make it happen." John's stomach twisted as the truth slowly began to surface. He wasn't just a target of petty complaints. He was the target, a person Karen had decided needed to be eliminated from her perfect little world. His irritation, his refusal to conform, had turned him into an enemy in her eyes. He wasn't just being harassed. He was part of her obsessive need for control. The lawn chairs were just the beginning. But why him? John's voice trembled with the force of his growing realization. Why send someone after me? Because, Karen's smile widened, I needed someone quiet. Someone who wouldn't fight back. Someone I could manipulate easily. And when I saw that you were stubborn enough to make a stand, I decided you'd be the perfect lesson for everyone. You had to be the example. John could hardly breathe now. The figure, the masked intruder, who he thought was a random threat, wasn't random at all. They were her agent, her enforcer. He was never just dealing with an unreasonable neighbor. He was up against someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The masked figure raised the knife again, stepping closer, and John's survival instincts kicked in. He dove toward the side of the house, hoping to break their line of sight, but before he could make it even halfway, Karen's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Stop him. At her command, the figure lunged forward, but in that moment of hesitation, John's heart surged with clarity. This was his chance. He spun around, running straight toward the open door of his house, the sound of footsteps behind him growing louder. His hand fumbled for the doorknob as the intruder's breath grew closer, and just as the figure reached out to grab him, John slammed the door shut in their face. The lock clicked into place with a finality that sent a shudder through his body. His pulse thundered in his ears as he leaned against the door, chest heaving. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, from the other side of the door, Karen's voice came again, chilling and almost triumphant. You can't hide forever, John. You'll have to face the consequences. John stood there, trembling, his heart still racing. What had just happened? Was he safe for now? Or had this only been the beginning of something far worse? As he sank to the floor, his mind swirled with the truth of the situation. He had just barely escaped with his life, but the game was far from over. Whatever Karen's plans were, they hadn't stopped tonight. They'd only just begun.